This is a Nazi cloning experiment. And this is Japan's Unit 731 biological warfare testing. But these are only two of the most horrific experiments from World War II that actually happened, and they're not the only ones. Why did the Nazis really freeze people alive? And what did Joseph Mengele actually do to twins at Auschwitz? Well, today, I'll be answering these questions and many more once and for all, because my goal by the end of this video is not just for you to know what happened, but more importantly, to understand why these experiments actually happened. To kick things off, I'm looking at one of the most brutal experiments conducted during the war, Nazi freezing experiments. It sounds completely inhumane, and it absolutely was, but it must have happened for a reason, right? Well, these experiments involved subjecting prisoners to extreme cold to study hypothermia for Luftwaffe pilots and Eastern Front soldiers. Victims were immersed in ice water at temperatures between 2 to 4 degrees Celsius for up to 3 hours, or left naked in sub-zero conditions, monitored until near death, then rewarmed via methods like hot water or body heat from women prisoners. But why were these experiments even conducted? They were driven by wartime needs after Luftwaffe losses in Russia. The Nazis claimed they needed data on treating hypothermia, but that didn't work out as intended. After all the experimenting and almost 90 deaths, there wasn't even any meaningful scientific gain from these sadistic experiments. This horrific research later influenced the Nuremberg Code, which established the requirement for consent in all medical research. But the Nazis weren't the only ones conducting horrific experiments. Japan's Unit 731 conducted some of the most brutal experiments in human history. Japan's Unit 731 conducted live dissections without anesthesia on infected prisoners to study diseases like plague and anthrax. Victims were literally cut open alive while conscious. Their organs were removed for analysis while they were still breathing. But why did this need to happen? The Japanese military wanted to advance their bioweapon capabilities for use in the China invasions. The scale of dehumanization was staggering. Unit 731 referred to their victims as logs, completely stripping them of their humanity. And here's the disturbing part. After the war, the US granted immunity to the perpetrators in exchange for their research data, leading to a massive cover-up. This decision has fueled modern demands for Japan to issue formal apologies and acknowledge these atrocities fully. The Nazis also conducted sterilization experiments that were equally horrific. These experiments were super horrific. They involved prisoners' genitals being irradiated with X-rays to induce sterility, causing severe burns, infections, and cancer. This was horrific, and I'm not even sure if the reason they claimed is enough to make this an experiment. I think this is just torture. It was done to enable mass sterilization for so-called racial purity under their twisted eugenics policies. These experiments are particularly notorious because they directly targeted reproduction and were explicitly linked to the Holocaust genocide. But if you thought that was horrific, the next one is even worse. Joseph Mengele's twin experiments at Auschwitz. Twins were subjected to measurements, injections, and surgeries in an attempt to prove heredity and racial theories. Many were killed intentionally, so Mengele could perform autopsies and compare their organs. At Auschwitz in 1944, Mengele experimented on over 582 children, killing more than 100 of them. The stated reason was racial genetics research, but in reality, this was nothing more than pseudoscience wrapped in Nazi ideology. Mengele is particularly notorious, not just for targeting children, but for evading justice after the war. And I figured out where he went. After the war, he fled to South America and lived there for many years. Ultimately, though, he died in Brazil in 1979, unfortunately, never facing a trial. He became a symbol of Nazi pseudoscience and the depths of human cruelty. Now let's be honest, so far, these have been absolutely horrifying. But before I continue, it's more horrifying that you've watched this far into the video without subscribing. Do it? Okay, but now I need to tell you about experiments that literally tested the limits of human survival in the most brutal ways possible. The Nazis conducted high-altitude experiments where prisoners were placed in pressure chambers that simulated extreme high altitudes. This caused their bodily fluids to literally explode inside their body. Conducted by Sigmund Rascher at Dachau in 1942, these experiments were performed on 200 prisoners, killing 80 of them. The supposed purpose was Luftwaffe ejection safety research. They wanted to understand what happened to pilots who had to bail out at high altitudes. But the experiments were conducted with such brutality that even Heinrich Himmler personally praised Rascher for his work, which tells you everything you need to know about how sadistic these tests were. If you don't know who Himmler is, to summarize, he is one of the main leaders of the Nazi Party and one of the most powerful people at the time of the war. Similar to this, Unit 731 also conducted frostbite experiments that were equally brutal. Prisoners had their limbs repeatedly frozen in ice, then thawed and tested for various treatment methods. Conducted by Hisato Yoshimura in Harbin, these experiments were performed on hundreds of Chinese and Korean prisoners. But this isn't the worst part. The justification was preparation for Manchurian winter warfare. Japanese soldiers needed to understand how to treat frostbite in the brutal winter condition. The worst part that makes these experiments particularly notorious is that they were repeated on children and even infants, showing the complete lack of humanity in Unit 731's operations. Now for one of the stranger experiments. The Nazis forced prisoners to consume only seawater in experiments designed to test desalination methods. This caused extreme dehydration and organ failure in the victims. Hans Eppinger conducted these experiments at Dachau in 1944 on 90 Roma prisoners. I think this has to be one of the stupidest experiments ever. They wanted to know if sailors could survive on seawater if stranded at sea. But the experiments reduced victims to complete desperation, and the data collected was ultimately useless because the methods were so unethical and unscientific. This is surely just an excuse for torture. Like Unit 731 that took things even further with their biological weapons field tests. They released pathogens on actual Chinese cities via fleas and bombs, causing massive epidemics among civilian populations. Led by Ishii from 1940 to 1943, these tests killed over 200,000 civilians. This wasn't about research. This was about depopulation and biological warfare on a massive scale. Villages were deliberately infected with plague, cholera, and other diseases. The scale of civilian deaths makes this one of the most notorious war crimes of the entire conflict. The Nazis conducted sulfonamide experiments, where they deliberately infected wounds with bacteria, then treated them with experimental drugs. These were performed at Ravensbrück from 1942 to 1943 on dozens of Polish women, who became known as the rabbits due to the way they were forced to hop after the experiments damaged their legs. The purpose was supposedly to test wound treatments for German soldiers, but in practice, the infections were deliberately aggravated to make the experiments more useful, causing immense suffering. And the Nazis also conducted bone, muscle, and nerve regeneration experiments, where tissues were removed and transplanted without any anesthesia whatsoever, which were also performed at Ravensbrück on Polish prisoners. These experiments were supposedly for injury recovery research, but in reality, they just caused permanent mutilations. The Nazis infected over 1,200 inmates with malaria through mosquito bites and drug testing. Conducted by Klaus Schilling at Dachau, these experiments killed more than 500 people. The stated purpose was developing tropical vaccines, but the sheer volume of deaths shows how little regard there was for human life. And finally, the Nazis exposed hundreds of victims to mustard gas and phosgene at camps like Natzweiler and Sachsenhausen. These experiments were conducted to develop antidotes for chemical warfare, but they caused severe burns and respiratory deaths in nearly all subjects. These experiments underscore World War II's complete and total disregard for human life. The data from these experiments holds no ethical value today. In fact, most medical experts and ethicists reject using any of this data entirely because of how it was obtained. If you enjoyed this video and want to know whether a secret Unit 731's virus really turned people into zombies, click the video on screen.